Imagine buying a video game console that cost over $1,200 in today's money, or a console with only 6 games at launch and barely any more coming, or a console developed by a world leader in consumer electronics that somehow barely knew how to console. Yeah, in a few of these cases, that's exactly what happened. These consoles were bad, really bad. Let's take a look at four of the worst. At the height of its popularity, the Sega Genesis appeared like it might have been on its way towards knocking Nintendo off of its throne. It had a world class system, sharper advertising, and for a brief time in 1993, a greater market share. However, Sega had a bigger problem. They had debt. A lot of debt. And as anyone who has ever been drowning in loans knows, when you don't have a lot of money, you make a lot of dumb decisions. Sometimes that means buying $10 sneakers, even though their bottoms are made of cardboard. Other times, that means pushing a video game console when you have another one just around the corner, undercutting your own developers and marketing efforts. Does that second one not sound familiar? Then you probably didn't work for Sega in the mid 1990s. The Sega 32X, codenamed Project Mars, was built around the idea that Sega needed a transition console before the release of the Sega Saturn. The 32X wasn't its own system, it was an add-on. It came with 32-bit hardware and could be inserted into the 16-bit Sega Genesis. The console had promise, with advanced graphics, backwards compatibility, and the ability to produce over 32,000 colors. The price was $159, which even in 1994 was relatively affordable. The weird thing about the 32X wasn't so much that the system was bad, it was pretty good. It got solid reviews, the graphics were strong, and some games, particularly Doom, were highly praised as capable of showing what the system could produce. The challenge was the timing. So, follow this for a second. The year is 1994, and while the Genesis is doing well, it was starting to slip. The Atari Jaguar and the 3DO had entered the market. Both were 32-bit systems that outclassed the Sega Genesis in terms of graphics and processing speed. The Sega Saturn wouldn't be ready until 1995, and Sega was worried that they would be too late into the market and allow the 3DO and Jaguar to get a head start. Fearful of the 2-year gap, Sega headquarters in Japan disagreed with Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske and pushed for the release of an add-on as a stopgap measure. In fact, the idea of an add-on was literally born at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show when the Atari Jaguar made its premiere, spooking Sega executives. 6 months later, the 32X made its premiere as an add-on that you would literally insert into the top of the original Genesis. So, was it an add-on? Yes. Was it its own system? Sort of. Did it play Sega games? Yes. Would it play Saturn games? Sega said they'd get back to you on that one, but the answer was no, and that was problem number one. More important, and more problematic, was the game library. Only 6 games were available at launch, despite promises of 12 being ready to market, and not all of those got great reviews. The problems only snowballed from there. Third-party developers didn't want to develop games for a cheap system that would be obsolete in less than a year when the Saturn was supposed to make its premiere. Games that were being made were pushed out the door with an emphasis on speed, not quality, resulting in inferior products. Sega kept screwing up internally. Development kits came out late, the system was slow, and in some cases couldn't even engage in proper texture mapping. Only 40 games were released for the 32X, and the system tanked. The price dropped, then dropped, then dropped again, and Sega ultimately discontinued the system, with the final products actually selling for only $19.95. In the end, only 665,000 systems were sold. Of the 5 systems that are considered to be part of the 5th generation of video game consoles, only the 3DO did worse. Oh, speaking of the 3DO, let's talk about that disaster, because man, was that bad. The 3DO interactive multiplayer experience was the idea of Trip Hawkins, founder of Electronic Arts. With his ample experience in the video game industry, it was widely assumed that Hawkins knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, reality would not bear that idea out. Hawkins created the 3DO with the idea that he could compete with Nintendo and Sega based on royalty rates. He would only seek a royalty rate of $3 sold per game, a much lower rate than Sega and Nintendo were charging at the time. One of the many challenges for the 3DO was that Hawkins didn't have the technical capacity or expertise to manufacture the device on his own. Instead, he approached other companies, including Sega. Now, ultimately, Panasonic created the first 3DO, but this design for manufacturing led to a series of major problems. So normally, console designers have the resources to sell their systems at a loss, then make a profit on the games. Because 3DO was using third parties to create the systems, 3DO and Panasonic had much higher costs. The end result? The system sold for $699, about $1,268 in today's currency, making it the most expensive inflation-adjusted system of all time. Other models would be made by other manufacturers and sold at less expensive prices, with the Gold Star version being sold at $399. But when a system is the most expensive ever, it better have graphics that basically give you a foot rub when you play. Of course, that wasn't the case. The 3DO was meant to be more than a video game system, with Hawkins hoping that the system would be capable of high-definition television and internet services. Neither panned out. The system launched in 1993 to mixed reviews. Cost was a major factor. So were technological factors. The 3DO had major updates leading to launch, which meant that games were delayed. This also caused manufacturing delays, and after a month, the console had barely sold more than 30,000 units, an appallingly low number. The graphics for 1993 were very good, and the system was, for a brief time, the most technologically advanced system on the market. Emphasis on a brief time. See, again, 3DO failed to see the future of the market, which saw Sony's PlayStation, arguably the most revolutionary system of all time, make its American premiere less than a year after the 3DO. That system performed better, had more games, more third-party support, and was priced at $299, which was $100 cheaper than the cheapest 3DO model. The 3DO is dead. The business model was a failure, and the cost was a disaster. Funny thing? There were still more than a dozen 3DO systems ultimately produced, and some of them would actually wind up selling. By the time the system was completely discontinued in 1996, more than 2 million units had been sold, which isn't a bad number at all, although it's barely a drop in the bucket compared to the more than 102 million PlayStations sold. It is impossible to think of Apple without thinking of massive financial, critical, and commercial success. The company is, as of this recording, the second richest company in the world, worth around $3 trillion, give or take a few hundred billion. Of course, the company is far from perfect. In fact, in the 90s, it seemed like it was headed for failure. A large part of that failure, and unmooring from Apple's technical excellence, was the Pippin. Apple's attempt to enter the video game market was strange and followed a model that proved to ultimately be set for failure. The Pippin wasn't meant to be a system on its own. Not really. So follow this for a second. At the time, Apple wanted other third-party developers to take the base software architecture of the system and innovate it. It was actually doing similar things with other computer products that it was producing at the time. As long as the systems stuck to the same basic design, Apple was good. This was referred to as Apple's clone initiative. When Steve Jobs returned Apple as CEO, he immediately stopped it, but that's a story for another video. As a result of this proposal, Bandai, a video game developer, partnered with Apple to develop games for the Bandai Atmark Pippin. The system had a 66 MHz CPU and a 16-bit color system, which was actually faster than every other fifth-generation system except for the Nintendo 64. You could use the device to surf the internet via a built-in modem. So, faster system, more powerful processor, more innovations. Bound to be a success, right? Okay, first, let's talk about price. The introductory offering at the time of its 1996 release? $599, which is about $1,200 in today's money. Ouch. Promises quickly went unfulfilled. Bandai created a development plan that included an Ethernet connection, standard CD-ROM support, and additional integration with Microsoft technologies. Never happened. Apple's vision for the system? Too broad. In interviews at the time, Apple said they wanted the device to be used for, quote, educational, entertainment, and information purposes. Great idea, but one that was more than a little ahead of its time and not supported by available technology. Third-party developers? Nope. No major ones, save for Bandai, were signed. This meant that the system suffered from a major lack of games, in addition to an ongoing identity crisis. Only 25 or so games were ever released for the system. A second Pippin, the Katz Media Player 2000, was also licensed to produce a Pippin model, but this was only meant to support basic media and higher resolution CD-ROM functions. It was also meant to be sold only in Europe and Canada, not America or Japan, where the Bandai Pippin was theoretically being sold. Still with me? Awesome. The whole thing was a confusing disaster. It was a late entry into the fifth-generation console war, and every other system at the time, the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and N64, were already on the market. Apple didn't have the marketing prowess or brand recognition that we take for granted today, and at the time, their label was crap. Bandai pulled the system out of America and shipped the remaining units to Japan. In the end, the system sold a mere 42,000 copies. And last, let's talk about another video game legend. The Atari 2600 was one of the most impactful home consoles at the time, selling more than 30 million units and basically creating the home video game console market. Its successor, the Atari 5200, is one of the biggest commercial disasters of the early 80s. First, the 5200 itself. There were slight improvements to the CPU and available memory over the 2600. The 5200 also boasted better performance and graphics than the 2600, as well as its competitors, including the Intellivision. Does that sound like a new system? So it still wasn't. Yeah, there were some innovations. This also included an automated switcher that gave the player a layer of convenience by ensuring that they didn't have to manually switch the signal from the TV to a video game. There were also 4 controller ports, and the controllers, well, they looked like this. They had a joystick, keypad, buttons, and more. Of course, the joystick was so innovative that it didn't actually work. Reports noted that the joystick didn't automatically return in the center, meaning you had to manually bring the joystick back to the middle of the pad. Even in the 80s, that was bad. Things just kept going downhill. The system did have some improvements, but it was still too close to the 2600 in terms of graphics. Even worse is that the initial model was incompatible with 2600 games, and this lack of backwards compatibility meant that it just wasn't worth it for many consumers to upgrade their systems. The system needed to start scratch in terms of games, but they didn't have many offerings. The 5200 first shipped with a copy of Super Breakout, which wasn't new, with copies of the same game having shipped with the Atari 2600 in 1979 and 1981. So the lead new game wasn't actually new. And this was a perpetual problem. New versions of quite a few games were produced, but they weren't substantially different than games that were already available on the 2600. It would be like buying 10 versions of Skyrim and not experiencing any real differences. Yeah, let's just move on. All of this hurt sales. The 5200 was supposed to sell more than 30 million copies. Instead, it barely sold more than a million. In 1984, Atari moved on as well, announcing the Atari 7800. At the same press conference, they said that the 5200 had been discontinued after barely 2 years on the market. What's the conclusion here? Well, there's a few. You have to innovate, and systems like the 32X and 5200 didn't really do that. At the same time, you can't massively change the business model of the world without financial backing. The 3DO tried that, and it was a disaster. Finally, you have to make sure that you have support of the general technological ecosystem. Many of these systems failed because they didn't properly build on what was needed from third-party developers. And that led to a disaster. And that is it for this edition. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. Please, please, please hit the subscribe button so you can see new videos that come out. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment and let us know what else you want to see out there. As always, have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, folks.